All right, so was the October SAT harder than usual? Answer is no. All right, so I recommend you guys watch the entire video because I'm going to be explaining everything, how the digital SAT is actually scored, how it can benefit you, clear up some misconceptions, and etc., etc. But really the important thing here is that you understand all the points I'm making before sounding off in the comments, right? So first off, I just want to address a concern some people had regarding a video we made called October Digital SAT will be easier, here's why. And a lot of people thought that the questions were going to be easier, right? And that's a fair point because you think that a easier test means that the questions are easier. However, the video, I just took a screen snippet here, says the questions on the October Digital SAT may be of the same difficulty or not changing in difficulty, but it will be easier to score higher on nevertheless because the claim in the video was that the SAT would be scored on a curve, all right? So now we know that the difficulty of the questions is not dependent on the month, but why did it feel harder, or even in some cases for you, easier? So why exactly did the October SAT feel harder or easier? Well, just a couple facts out of the way. The SAT relies on a pool of questions to pick from, and there can be different strings and forms of questions that are generated on test day to make sure there's no cheating, right? In each of these questions, as we know, are calibrated to either be easy, medium, or hard in difficulty. Now, the big things here that might have made it seem harder or easier were because of the unpretested child questions. This doesn't make any sense because you don't know what it is, but I'll explain everything later. Now, the other points here is that there were new question types tested / variations that were not on the practice tests, right? So you have to think about this. There's a lot of different question types that the SAT is experimenting with all the time, right? So if they have these new question types as experimental questions in previous SATs, that can show up as those real questions that count towards your score on the real SAT, right? On the October SAT. Now, the thing with the practice tests is that they're a little bit outdated, right? There's been a couple SATs in between, practice test 5 and 6, and therefore there's stuff there that if you're practicing with might be a little outdated. Now, there's also a concern over the question difficulty being misclassified, right? This is very unlikely in a lot of cases, but it does happen. That's why College Board goes in and does that post equating, as you'll see later. Now, basically what happens here is that you have to think about how experimental questions work. They're placed in real DSATs from a representative group of students, right? They're judging how hard a question is based on the performance of those students. But you have to think about all those students, right? If you place that question at the beginning of Module 2, more students are going to have time to get through that question versus if that question was at the end of Module 2, you can't control all those psychological variables and factors, right? And so that really has to go through a lot of rigorous testing for it to be 100% accurate, which we know it isn't. And therefore, if a question shows up as being easier when in reality it's actually harder for you, depending on where the question is placed or some other psychological factors, and that's just something you cannot control. And there's just these miscellaneous obvious things, right? Maybe it was nerves, maybe there's time pressure, pacing issues, or maybe it's just self-doubt, guys. You gotta feel confident. Now let's talk about why the October SAT is actually easier to score higher on. And this is where we're gonna get into the insider info, all right? So first off, does the SAT have a curve? They claim they do not, but they also explicitly state in their technicals manual, which I'll link in the description, which is pretty much the framework for the source of this entire video. And they claim to use post-test statistical reviews, right? Which consist of 4 things: initial scale confirmatory analyses, which that's the big thing we'll get into. So number 1 and 4 will impact your SAT score directly. Number 4 is just, don't cheat and do sus stuff. Number 2, that's just the experimental questions. Number 3 is just them analyzing questions for fairness and equity and all that. But now, let's get into the thing that you're not going to see on any other YouTube channel, right? Any other Google search. You can Google this right now and you'll not find a single thing on it, right? So this is how the questions are actually created on the digital SAT. What happens is that you have a parent model, right? And the parent model is essentially serving as a core template and structure for these questions. Now, it's important to know that each of these parent models correspond with a certain content area that the SAT or College Board wants to test. And this is a little misleading right here, the easy, medium, hard questions. The difficulty of those questions is not determined until after testing. You'll see right here the child cues undergo testing. Essentially, you get child questions that are derived from the parent model, right? So the parent model here, you're going to get child questions that are created based on the template provided from the parent model. And so you have these child questions, and these child questions need to undergo testing to see if they're easy, medium, or hard, right? So what happens here is that they can either get invalidated or validated. Now, how do you determine that? You determine that through these experimental questions, right? And that's a big factor of how the SAT creates questions. So what they'll do is they'll place these child questions in some random students' real digital SAT, and based on how they perform and other representative groups of students perform, you determine if it's easy, medium, or hard. Now, using their analyses and whatever trends or whatever, they determine whether it was fair, equitable, as well as the difficulty level, right? So they don't want it to be too easy or too difficult. They want it to not show bias. So if there's a certain bias against a certain demographic, they will invalidate it, very prone to being invalidated. And also they want to see if it's actually testing what the content area that they want. So whether that be a specific mathematical skill, or maybe that's something like analytical reading or something, I don't know. But if it does get invalidated, what happens is it will be subject to either being removed entirely or revised and going through this entire process again. Now, if it does get validated, right, after it goes through these testings and it's determined to be very fair and equitable, etc., what happens is that the parent model that is associated with those child questions gets approved, right? And so you get the approved parent model, and you'll see this right here. The validated portion goes to the pre-tested child questions. These pre-tested child questions are the exact same ones that underwent the testing, right? So these experimental questions are the pre-tested child questions that have been approved for use. So we know how difficult those pre-tested child questions are because they've already been tested on real students, right? So those are already labeled as either easy, medium, or hard with cold hard statistics and facts and data to back them up. But now what we have is this approved parent model, which, as you know before, it proves as the core template and structure of the questions. Now that it's been approved, what College Board is going to do is pump out a bunch of other questions called unpretested child questions. These unpretested child questions are never tested on a subset of students or anything before they're put into your real digital SAT, which is going to show up on your October digital SAT, and that is going to give you an estimated difficulty, right? These questions have not been determined to have the actual difficulty. College Board just assumes their difficulty because it's derived from the same parent model as these pre-tested child questions. And so now the questions you get on your real digital SAT is going to be some experimental questions, the unpretested child questions, and then these infamous unpretested child questions. All right, so what, right? So we know how the SAT creates the questions now, but what does that even mean? Well, do you remember the initial scale confirmatory analyses, whatever that means? I mean, God, the SAT loves to use corporate jargon buzzwords. Like, if you guys need practice with the SAT reading, I would definitely consider reading their manuals because it is very similar in nature, right? It's just so dense and a lot of words you don't need, but whatever. So we know the unpretested child questions are questions that have not been individually tested on students yet, but because they're based on the same parent model as those pre-tested questions, those experimental questions on real digital SATs, College Board just assumes they will behave similarly, all right? So what this means is that these unpretested child questions, which have not been tested on a subset of people yet, can appear on your SAT, all right? And that will happen. That's a guarantee. And these questions do count towards your score, okay? And the thing is, as we know, their difficulty is not set in stone. It's only estimated based on the parent model. And so obviously the College Board can't just leave it at that because that would not be fair and equitable. And if a question turns out to be easier or harder than they expect, then they have to go in post-test and do their initial scale confirmatory analyses, right? They adjust the equating process based on how actual students performed on that question on test day. So literally other students' performances on that same test with those same questions will impact your score in some way if those unpretested child questions turn out to be easier or harder than expected. Now, with these points in mind, we know that the October DSAT was the last DSAT for many seniors who are applying to college early through early decision or action. So that creates more stress, more chance of missing questions, and therefore making this a really real possibility. Many seniors are also focusing on college applications over the SAT. And this is actually interesting as well. The fall DSATs are also some of the first ones that the juniors start to take. And because it's their first DSATs, right, the scores tend to be lower due to inexperience and inadequate preparation. And the same trend will continue for November and December if you're curious. All right, so now let's make some conclusions, right? So based on this, we know that for the fall test dates, a larger proportion of students will get specific unpretested child questions wrong, all right? Based on all this, the stress, the focus, the specific population taking the DSAT, right? And so College Board will see this and therefore use their equating to adjust the impact of said questions, right? Because if you had a question that they determined to be easy initially, and this is very drastic, usually it does not jump up like this, but if it turns out that everybody missed a question, right, now it's classified as a hard question. And they can't deduct the same amount of points as they would for an easy question because now it's reclassified as a hard question. And they also need, this is important, they need these scores to be a bell curve, right? So if a test truly, like the October SAT, for a lot of you who might think that, oh my God, this was the hardest test ever, if everybody did significantly worse, they need to bump everyone up because they need a bell curve, right? They need scores to be comparable month to month because they need to uphold their claim of being a standardized exam. So this brings us to number 3, which ties everything together. This will create a more lenient curve for you, which makes it easier for everyone who prepared well, right? Actually prepare for the DSAT, because if you didn't prepare, it might actually hurt you to score higher on the digital SAT, regardless of how hard of a difficulty the actual questions were. So don't panic, guys. This is just the cold hard facts. If you want to see it straight from College Board, I have the exact manual technicals document right in the description. Feel free to go through it and see for your own eyes. It's also important to note that these benefits that you get are not going to be like game-changing 200 plus points, right? At most, probably 10, 20, 30 points, but that can be the difference between a 1480 and maybe like a 1510, right? That's cool. So yeah, if you guys have any other thoughts, concerns, or, whatever, just comment down below. I hope I answered a lot of misconceptions, maybe questions you had regarding how the DSAT is scored, because literally this information has never been put out on YouTube before. So it's very interesting, guys. If you want more content like this, make sure you subscribe. Check out our other SAT review videos, and thank you for watching.